So the title of my presentation is going to be Where Do Numbers Come From? And I want to sort of introduce a little bit of terminology to address this question and present what I consider a hypothesis for explaining the origin of numbers, which is considering cultural factors, but embedded in biological nature of the human species. So when you ask these questions, usually we can see that, you know, mathematics is ubiquitous in the modern world. We use it for developing science, for entertainment, for counting votes for political elections and so on. So we are really in our normal, you know, nowadays culture, we can see that numbers are just ubiquitous and we're just fascinated by them, and then they're all over the place. It just turn on your cell phone and you will see numbers measuring all kinds of things. So they're really part of our life today in the modern world. And so we get a sense that since they're all over the place, there must be something deep about them that is almost transcendent to the human species, since they're so present and ubiquitous. So normally when you ask this question in mathematics, normally you have an approach which may be axiomatic, for example, or with formal definitions. So, you know, axiomatic system would be, let's say, those that presented for natural numbers, for instance, from Giuseppe Peano, the Italian mathematician, and then you get a list of axioms of how you're going to be ruling what's true and not true, and how you're going to be setting up the whole apparatus. Or you could have sometimes set theoretical definitions for what a number is, like in this case, for example, the definition given by John von Neumann, or what is each natural number in terms of set membership and empty sets. So the question, of course, here is that we may, in order to do mathematics and pure mathematics, this may be very fruitful approaches, but we want to address the question of where the numbers come from. Then we need to ask the question of where are these assumed primitives coming from? For example, the notion of unitas or unity in Peano's work, or the notion of successor, where is that coming from? Or the notion of a set, let alone the empty set, where is it coming from? What is to be a member of a set? What is formal language? What is notation? Where are all these things coming from, which are all necessary for these mathematical practices to be developed? So if we just look at pure mathematics, we won't give an answer unless we start to digging in each of the primitives that we have here, which lead us to further questions. And that's actually part of my research agenda, which is to try to understand the nature of mathematics beyond just numbers. And then we have to go through all these little assumptions and try to see, what is the origin of these things. Anyway, in philosophy of mathematics, sometimes the most classic approaches you would have, Platonism, logicism, formalism, intuitionism, based on, the usual suspects from Plato all the way to Frege, Russell, David Hilbert, or Brouwer, and all mathematicians doing their work in this, except from Plato, the work is done in the 19th century, early 20th century, based largely in European philosophy. Going back to, let's say, just to pick up some here, Descartes, Leibniz, or Kant, or Boole, father of, let's say, Boolean algebra later, and so on. So this is kind of a very Europeocentric view. And not only that, all these views stopped pretty much with the knowledge that we have about many things up to around the 19th century. But after the 19th century, many things have happened. For example, all the knowledge of these great minds had and wrote amazing proposals, they're missing things that we know today about the evolution and the biology of species and the origin of lives and genetics. What is the mind, then the unconscious aspects of the mind, what is thought and brain, all the developments in neuroscience, everything we know now about language and language variation around the globe, not just in Indo-European languages. So all these things explaining cultural variation, engagement with material practices and so on, we have learned amazing amount of things. And here, I'm just going to capture all this just by putting here the picture of Charles Darwin, who essentially gave a completely different view of where the Homo sapiens, or where we as animals stand in the whole ecosystem. So By now, then the question of mind and intelligence and abstraction get a completely different perspective that is not captured by any of these traditional philosophies that you see in mathematics. So unfortunately, there's no philosophy really that, as I'm aware of, philosophy of mathematics that really considered, let's say, all these new developments. And the idea would be to kind of update the philosophy of mathematics with the new things we know about the mind and language and abstraction and communication and so on. So the idea here would be to sort of try to present like a naturalistic account that is consistent with current scientific knowledge, let's say post-19th century, which would include, let's say, knowledge about the mind and the brain and biological evolution and cultural evolution, which is different from natural selection-driven, let's say, biological evolution, notions of, language and variations of language and abstraction, concept formation, ontogenesis, learning, and on and on and on. So if I can just bring like a little bit of an analogy here, is to consider, for example, the question of where does life come from? Well, up to the 19th century, again, a large belief was that it was just spontaneous generation. So there was some type of matter that did not have an élan vital, or like this sort of a genesis for life, and other types of things did. And that's what Aristotle believed and wrote about it, and every thinker pretty much, and Augustine and every thinker up to the 19th century pretty much believed and developed theories about the origin of life based on the notion of spontaneous generations. Of course, as I said, 19th century, big changes. And one of the changes is the work of Louis Pasteur, who really, with the use of scientific method, put a completely different explanation of the origin of life based on microorganisms that was completely absent up to then. So the question I want to raise here is that if we take the question of where does life come from, or where do numbers come from, I want to propose that these can be addressed as a scientific question, not just a purely philosophical or axiomatic or set theoretical definitions, let's say. We need to address with kind of update our discourse of how we approach this question. So by this, I don't mean let's get rid of philosophy. What I'm saying is let's update philosophy and then incorporating much more of a natural approach. So today there's no philosopher that could be considered a serious philosopher who would defend, for example, a position on the spontaneous generation of life and develop a whole theoretical philosophical apparatus around it because it's simply non-tenable anymore. Still, there's a lot of philosophy of life that you can develop, but it has to be updated. So the idea is now to address that kind of question, what do numbers come from, with a scientific, I would say, approach, using those methods and those practices and kind of updating our ways of questioning. So part of that is, for example, recently there was a little of a mini debate in the trends in cognitive sciences where precisely asking those kinds of questions. Is there, for example, an evolved capacity for number? In this case, considering a naturalistic approach, but then zooming in the naturalistic approach to see how much weight is purely biological, or how do you put, for example, cultural practices sustained by biological mechanisms and phenomena, for example, and where do we place that dynamics? So let's start now, for example, with certain things we know since the 1940s. And when I say we, is the scientific community. So, for example, when we have an organism that is able to discriminate discrete, let's say, stimuli, it would have, in the case of humans and many other species, it would be relatively easy and fast and error-free to discriminate these three different type of stimuli you see there. But it would take longer to discriminate them, or would come with more errors when the amount of the quantity of these dots, let's say, or these stimuli increases in numerousness and quantity. And this is a phenomenon that's been studied since the 1940s, and it was coined with the term of subitizing, coming from the Latin subitare, like subitus, abrupt and fast. Something we don't need to be trained or go to school to. We do it very fast, efficiently, and pretty much error-free. Another such mechanism is the capacity to discriminate, let's say, relative quantity. In this case, for example, if we have a visual apparatus that can discriminate, for example, or have a stimulation through light, we could discriminate what's black dots from white dots in this case, when their ratio differs substantially, as opposed to, let's say, when the quantity of each of them is similar, or the ratio is close to, let's say, 1. And that is, let's say, something that has been termed as large quantity discrimination. And again, you don't need any training on anything in particular of language or cultural interventions and so on. Pretty much it's a pretty solid, well-established result that you can see not just in humans, but in many species. Now, the thing is that this has come a little bit of a sign for many to claim that now this is about mathematics, and you would see, many papers and book chapters and proposals or addressing based pretty much on these capacities, that there's, like, for example, monkey mathematical abilities or numerical abilities in arithmetic in infancy, and some would have claimed that this kind of single neuron arithmetic occurring at a level of single neurons, and many authors then referring to non-primate ability, mathematical and numerical, and so on. Numerical cognitions in bees and other insects, and so on. And then, of course, beyond academia, you would have media picking up, and then you would have, in the New York Times, for example, science section titles like, many animals can count, some better than you. Of course, very attractive title, based a little bit on the kinds of dynamics that I'm describing. And of course, the science media takes off and get all of a sudden very, splashy titles like "Fish as good as college students in number test," or, "Are you as smart as a mosquito fish?" Now, this in a certain way is a narrative that you see in media, but has led to a widely accepted view that I would call here nativist, that would sort of state that there is a biologically evolved capacity that is specific for number and arithmetic. So this is an important term to clarify here. So on the one hand, there is a biological development, let's say through natural selection, but it is specific for number and arithmetic. So this is a term that I want to unpack a little bit, because it means that the number and the arithmetic are in a certain way dissociated or separated from other functions. So they're not built on general purpose functions and so on. So this is now, the claim is something specific for it. So again, going back to that debate, of course, you could start asking, well, is it really the case that where there is an evolved capacity that is specific for number and arithmetic, and let alone, let's say, mathematics? And this is the kinds of debates that in the academic circle have been developed. So now there's some problems at different levels that we need to unpack. So the first one is that there's a issue of loose terminology and teleology, I would argue. So the first problem is that number is a highly polysemous term. So as you know, it is a term that exists in everyday language. So you have passport number, or a number of things, or even in technical domains like ordinal number, transfinite number, infinitesimal number, hyperreal number, and so on. And in all these cases, number means something different. Now, in the literature now, in the scientific literature of numerical cognition, there's also a lot of confusion in terminology. And this is not just me saying it now, other people have written about it since the 1980s. But usually there is a lot of, confusion between number and numeral. And numeral is, these are signs for numbers, standing or referring to numbers. So these are the signs of numbers, not the numbers, the number concept themselves. Or numerosity, this is a term that has been really misused, including myself. I've misused it also in the past. As it was coined, is really a way of measuring from the perspective of the experimenter, and this going back to the psychophysicists of the 1950s, like Stevens, for example, is essentially a scale of measuring the different type of stimuli, the numerousness of stimuli, the amount of dots or the amount of tones that you present to rats, pigeons, and infants. So numerosity today is taken to be a capacity. Some people write about different kinds of things so it's a lot of confusion of what the term means. But really what it means is something along the lines of like Celsius degrees to measure, for example, temperature. and it's a scale that's been invented. So then the experimenter has a terminology to refer to, oh, here's a stimulus numerosity 3, rather than saying that, for example, if the pigeon is able to discriminate it from one, the numerosity 2, then in order to avoid saying the pigeon has a concept of 3, then the experimenters in the 50s were very careful about the use of this term. In any case, quantity, numerosity, they're really, all over in the literature. And then sometimes number refer to something exact, sometimes is approximate, sometimes is symbolic, sometimes is not symbolic. So a lot of issues with terminology that affect actually the type of science we're doing, because it's very hard to do good science with a lot of confusion. And therefore also the extensions for what number is in terms of the adjectival properties of what counts as, let's say, numerical cognition or numerical abilities, numerical processing, numerical tasks, numerical stimuli, and so on and so forth, sometimes is referred to having all these various properties that you see here. So quite a bit of confusion, which is ultimately hurts the type of science we try to develop. Another point is when we bring in number into the explanatory proposal is also circular or teleological. So if we want to address, for example, the question of what is the origin of number, but we use the term number in the very system that we're trying to propose, for example, which would be the case of the so-called ANS or approximate number system, we really take here number as a pre-given, and we put it in the explanatory proposal, in the explanandum, in what we're trying to explain. So some scholars have said, for example, Andreas Nieder has said that numbers really is a natural kind, that we should consider it as a primitive, pre-existing the organism, in this case, humans or corvids or any your organism that you're studying. So that is a problem that I would say has a teleological flavor, in the sense that we're trying to explain something in terms of the utility and ubiquitousness that we see it in today. But the challenge would be, from my perspective, is to explain the nature of number without having to refer to number and break that teleological circularity. So that is the kind of issue that I was saying here, bringing number into the explanandum to try to explain number. So another point here is the overinterpretation of trained animal data. There's really huge, beautiful work done with animal cognition and looking at the training ability, the training capacities, how far can you push in training different organisms, different animals, different species to learn certain things. So there's no discussion that some of the results are really interesting and astonishing. But something that is rarely said, really, is that it takes a lot of training, and often really effortful, that requires environmental support, human intervention with manufactured instruments like screens and so on and so forth, which are provided by humans, providing the dietary conditions, all the environments in where they live, and so on. So there's no discussion that we can learn a lot about that. But when it comes to interpreting in terms of evolutionary arguments and natural selection, then we have to be really careful, because we can train, for example, macaques to do all kinds of things. Then they are really good at learning certain things and motor activities, and we can learn things about how they learn when we train them. The problem is, if we want to bring arguments to what do we learn about the evolution of locomotion in primates, for example, these two cases, we would have to be extremely careful, because there's a lot of human intervention, materials involved, and so on, as there's here. A picture I took from Jessica Cantlon's lab, which is, they're doing great work. So what I'm trying to say here is to put things in perspective when the goal is to bring evolutionary arguments. So the learning process really is, if you really analyze it, and I guess I take here from Canton's lab, it's some quote from their work saying like training a monkey on a simple quantity match to sample task can take over 4 months and 20,000 trials, only to achieve discrimination of collection at a 3-to-4 ratio and with a 75% accuracy. So that seems to me a little bit different from what we normally see, and let's say a concept of number, in which we distinguish, let's say, 8 from 7, not just 75% of the time, but the concept of 7 as a concept is distinct categorically distinct from, let's say, 8, and so on. The question is, how do we get to those? So you can't really do, for example, arithmetic with these proportions and after these kinds of trainings, and it looks, when you get into these trainings, we're really touching into a different kind of phenomena. So the outcome with respect to number usually is guided by associative learning in these kinds of training, and is rarely exact, as I was showing with this quote. Sometimes you see papers where the criteria for success is pretty weak. Sometimes it's just above chance. So as soon as the organism, the species, the animal does some kind of something above chance, is taken as having acquired the behavior and so on. Or sometimes it's 75% accuracy and so on. So these, of course, are very important, reliable results. All I'm saying here is that we should be very careful when to take them to be standing for number as we know it. And I'm going to give a definition of number in a few minutes. Now, the other problem, of course, is some of these generalizations, lack of validity regarding the exactness, which is one of the properties of number. When you do 2 plus 3, the result in arithmetic is 5, and that result is categorical in the sense that when you're doing the arithmetic, that is not just about approximations or probabilities or likelihoods that it could be 5. So that's something that we need to address, and that is largely absent in trained animal data, presumably because you have an important phenomenon that is missing, which is symbolic reference, and we will be talking about very, very soon. So trained animal data inform many interesting questions. There's no doubt about it, and they're very robust and reliable. So there's no criticism whatsoever there. The point here is that they're not necessarily about evolution and natural selection and biological endowment. And that is the point that I think we need to be very careful to make distinctions in order to move on with the practice of science. Another point that is missing in the literature quite a bit is human data. A lot of the work done with in numerical cognition and in the neuroscience of numerical cognition is largely done with humans who are, in pretty much in the Western industrialized society, or I would just say not necessarily Western, but industrialized. And that means, societies with specific types of cultural practices, specific types of writing systems, and more importantly, schooling and curricula. So what we're missing, if we want to look for evolutionary aspects here, is what happens in societies that are outside of this sort of industrialized or post-industrial industrial revolution societies, let's say, those that don't have practices of writing or schooling and so on. And those will be the relevant to investigate for the purpose of evolutionary claims. For example, writing, if we really take it in evolutionary sense, is very recent. It was just only in one spot in 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, and then a couple others a little later in China and Mesoamerica with the Mayas, but that's about it. So if we count the number of languages we have today on Earth, which depending on how you count dialectal variation and so on, it's about 5,000 languages extant today. Well, originally there's only very few that started to be written. So really human cognition is, in a more, let's say, wild sense, is a human cognition without writing for thousands of years. So if we take the Homo sapiens species to be 250,000 years old or something, depending on who you ask, but in that range, most of the history of humans, let alone hominins, the hominin lineage is without writing. So what we need to understand now is, what is the role of this new practice in the whole thing. So what happens then in societies how is that they deal with quantities when they don't have, this, which may reflect give a better picture of humanity before the invention of writing. And when you do that, and this is largely ignored in the literature, and you wouldn't really see it, let's say, in a title of a New York Times science piece is saying, you know, some insects count better than you. When you start looking at some other humans, where would have, for example, most languages that have been investigated, they would have natural quantifiers like few and several and many and so on. So those lexemes do exist. But by no means these languages exhibit exact quantification. And that's what we should be looking at. For example, a paper from Bauer and Sense a while ago, just documenting Aboriginal Australian languages out of nearly 200 languages from 13 different linguistic families, found that 90% of these languages lack numerals, so signs for numbers beyond 5. So this means it's not just a few exotic languages lost somewhere. This is pretty much what you observe in Aboriginal Australia, and certainly before the contact with the British in a couple of 200 years ago, which pretty much disseminated many of the cultures there. So the question to ask here, if you know, Australia is believed to be occupied by humans for at least 40,000 years. Some say that Northern Australia would have been occupied for about 50,000 years. Now, if you take it roughly, just to give a sense of what we're looking at here in this graph, you know, the Proto-Indo-European language, which is supposed to be the common origin, let's say, for many of the European languages, and the Hindi and Farsi languages, all the way to, from, you know, as I said, you know, Farsi and Hindi, all the way to Icelandic and Swedish, and going through, you know, Romance languages, Romanian and French and Spanish, etc. All those have this common, apparently theoretical ancestor only 7,000 years ago. So that is 1/7 of the time that Aboriginal Australian languages have been developed in that island. So that's really says something about the evolution of humans for nearly 50,000 years, but, you know, raising kids and gathering and you know, doing all kinds of things for, you know, gathering fish from the coast, and many activities that now we know are much more complex than it was been depicted so far in the Western literature, with more like new archaeological findings. But the point is, all that without the necessity of having exact quantification. Just 1 or 4 or 3 is good enough, and that is within the subitizing range. So the point is, beyond the subitizing range, apparently you can do perfectly well evolving for 50,000 years. That's 7 times the time that in which Proto-Indo-European languages have evolved. So similar patterns, more or less, found by Patience Epps and colleagues in other hunter-gatherer languages in South America, in Africa, and so on. So the fact that exact quantification is present today in our Western industrialized society, it's true, it's ubiquitous all over the place, but it has by no means is characteristic, apparently, from what it has been in human species for hundreds of thousands of years. So that should need to be included in any analysis of the origins of numbers, when we really want to get a good scientific explanation, and not probably jump too fast to a pure biological explanation. We need to say, well, if cockroaches can count, well, how is it that all these hundreds of thousands of millions of humans with perfectly healthy brains don't? And there's a big issue there. We need to know, either we're talking about different things, and if that's the case, we need to know what exactly is that we're talking about, or there's something that we have not explained yet, and we need to explain. So in sum, disregarding human data has some problems, because all language and cultures have natural quantifiers. That seems to be an important piece of the equation here. But exact quantification is far from being universal. And this has been also treated by the work of Caleb Everett in this very interesting book called Numbers. So the moral of this part of the talk is that language by itself does not lead to number. There's been some explanation is that, it's just humans that have language, that have developed, number and arithmetic, and that's a big difference with animals. Well, it is a big difference with non-human animals, but that doesn't explain the reason why there is exact quantification, because exact quantification appears to be a cultural trait, not a species-specific biological trait, as it is shown by these hundreds of languages spoken by hundreds of thousands of people, humans. So now the question is, we need to make some distinctions. So in order to progress, and this is what I propose, we need to start calling things with different names, in the same sense that, now we are in this pandemic, we don't just say a virus, we say, okay, is this particular virus? And then as soon as you identify a virus, then you have variants of the virus, and you give name to these variants of the viruses. And this occurs all over in science. When you have, diabetes type 1 and type 2, you make distinctions. We need to make those distinctions in numerical cognition to make more progress. So one such distinction I will propose here is what happens when we are perceiving things and quantities, in like the example I gave earlier, and what happened when we call these things certain things and with symbols. So as soon as we put something like a symbol like this, then we're doing what is called symbolic reference. We're calling this having 9. But the perception of this particular stimulus is not symbolic per se, unless you perceive it with a symbolic content after being told what 9 is and counting, and you have a language and so on. So we need to be really make this distinction, because symbols and numerals for these quantity that we learn later how to count, if we are immersed in the right cultural group, come with different forms. It could be in other languages or different writing formats with different bases and different axiomatic systems and so on, referring to quantities. But one important property is that these are relational and operable numbers. So even if you look at my, I look at my little computer laptop definition here, it would say that 8 is equivalent to the product of 2 and 4 and so on and so forth. So it would be defined in terms of relations with other numbers. So the number concepts are just much more complicated because they are relation and operable. So these properties then, if we really look at more a practical approach of prototypical properties for numbers when we count, the most used, let's say, empirically used numbers, the sequence we know as 1, 2, 3, and so on, they have a certain kinds of properties. They quantify exactly, not just in terms of probabilities or likelihoods. They are abstract because they transcend the perceptive modality. If it's acoustic, you can count tones. If it's visual, you can count dots, for example. That, in that sense, abstract. It has a cardinal sense. It has an ordinal sense. And when you count, is relational, just describe it. Combinative and operable. So you generate new numbers by combining other numbers. And all these are referred to symbolically. And that is a crucial property that we have every time we invoke this counting sequence. So that is exact symbolic quantification. So number, taken with these properties, I would just use it as a meaning exact symbolic quantification in the case of the most prototypical case as they're used. Now, of course, it doesn't include, let's say, infinitesimal numbers and transfinite numbers because they develop after this, but they're not prototypical. So these properties seem to be quite different from the ones that we were describing earlier, or what non-human animals exhibit in the lab, which are not necessarily quantifying exactly. They're certainly not referred to symbolically in the most fundamental sense. It's not clear that they're operable and so on and so forth. So they lack many of these properties. So therefore, whatever this phenomenon is occurring, which is interesting and relevant for many explanatory proposals for all kinds of things, we should not call them the same, because we confuse things. Again, it's kind of calling diabetes type 1 the same as being diabetes type 2 in a certain way. So good science really needs clear and non-confusing concepts. And I include myself here. I've used confusing concepts in the past. And now I realize that we come against a wall in a certain way. So how to properly refer to biologically endowed quantity-related phenomena that doesn't satisfy or do not satisfy the prototypical number properties I just described. So how would I characterize, let's say, these abilities and these capacities that seem to be biologically endowed, because we observe it in many species and they don't require training and language and so on. So if we call them numerical, then we're missing again, we're confusing too many confounds and components, as I was describing. Is it symbolic, is it not symbolic, is exact, not exact, and so on. So that is a confusing and not productive way of calling them. Now, we could call them maybe quantitative abilities, but the problem is that this already is a pretty loaded term, which usually is opposed to qualitative abilities. So it's not really a good term. So what I propose in that paper I just described earlier, as questioning the idea of whether there's a biologically evolved capacity specific for number, is the term quantical. So quantical would be referring to specifically, for example, subitizing and large quantity discrimination, and would be distinct from numerical. So here is just a little bit of a diagram, schematic diagram, let's say, putting a bunch of discrete quantity properties. They go from, let's say, small numerousness to high numerousness, measured in numerosity units. So, 1, 2, 3, this is a logarithmic scale. And then there's a gap, as you can see here, between the red area and the blue area, which is the symbolic reference gap. So here, many animals and non-human animals and humans would have this capacity, biologically endowed, but with the symbolic reference capacity, which is not, so the generic capacity may be biologically endowed in the human species, but the individual symbols referring to individual things is not something that is biologically determined or evolved, as we'll see in a minute. So when you start to have oral language or written numerals, and so all these require symbolic reference, going from natural quantifiers, which here they're in white because they're not exact, and everything else here exact, getting to complicated notations and forms in mathematics, for which you need explicit training and enculturation. You don't just come and have a brain ready to go to handle this, which would explain why is it that so many languages and cultures around the world before the invention of writing, for example, may have had. So the idea is that this quantical cognition would be biologically endowed, and as shown by hundreds of thousands of experiments, well, thousands maybe not, but many experiments, but all this is not biologically evolvable. And here I refer to the work of biological anthropologist Terry Deacon, who says that symbolic reference must be acquired by learning. And learning occurs in the ontogeny of individuals, during the lifespan of individuals, and lacks both the natural associations and transgenerational reproductive consequences that would make such references biologically evolvable. So the proper individual references cannot be biologically evolved. The capacity of having symbolic reference may have been evolved for reasons we don't understand well in the case of human species, but the actual symbolism and the associations with the things that refer to has to be acquired by learning in cultural context. So that was essentially part of the argument of that article of why is it really an evolved capacity of number. There was a response of one renowned neuroscientist saying, well, number faculty is rooted in our biological heritage, which is something I completely agree. The problem, of course, is what does it mean to root something in biology? Everything we do is rooted. I'm talking, I need to be rooting my speech in my biological heritage. I'm sitting on a chair and for which my bipedal capacities have to be adjusted to be seated now on this chair. So everything we do has some kind of biological root. There's no discussion there. The problem then is that we need to understand better what is biological evolution in terms of natural selection and other mechanisms purely in the purely biological sense. And then what are the things that humans, and some also to some extent other species, but largely by humans, have developed culturally using the biological apparatus, harnessing the biological apparatus. And that is the idea I'm proposing here, calling a biological enculturation. And this goes beyond natural selection. And that was a response to the critique by neither in that space. So let me unpack that to give you a sense of what that means, biological enculturation. So we have exact symbolic quantification beyond subitizing range. That's what we observe when we see cultures that have numbers, including ours. But they're motivated by cultural preoccupation, tracking valuables, stock management, trading, accounting. And these are activities that occur outside of natural selection proper. And they're supported by, enhanced by, material engagements and tools and offloading cognition, which I would imagine you heard some in the previous talk. And they require enculturation. You're not just born ready to use all these tools. You need to be enculturated into how you use them. So some of them involve material anchors, like, for example, the quipu here in the Inca practices that did not, as we know so far, did not have writing, but they rely largely on material anchors and material tools for developing many of the calculations perhaps that needed to do in order to build amazing buildings like Machu Picchu, for example. Some other Polynesian languages have been demonstrated to have, for example, resources in the grammatical and lexical properties of their languages that would serve as cognitive tools to support, even in the absence of writing, support arithmetic reasoning. And then also, of course, as I referred earlier, from 6,000 years ago, the writing technology, then you have a whole apparatus, all of which require conventionalized symbolic reference for exact quantification, namely number. So now when there is number, commonly is based in base 5 or base 10. Most languages and most cultures would rely on that. And usually the explanation is, oh, well, that's because we have 10 fingers. Which is not completely untrue, because there we go. Here we have a material anatomical articulator that we can recruit for now symbolically characterized quantities. And this is, based on this pentadactyl trait that we have as a species. But this is present in many species. Gorillas, chimpanzees, raccoons, even bats, and many other species are pentadactyl. And this pentadactylism is an evolved anatomical trait. So you have a morphological trait that is evolved biologically endowed. But none of these species would recruit those biologically endowed properties like pentadactylism to count or use it as symbolic reference. So that is what humans have that lead to recruit pentadactylism now for a cognitive, in this case, development for conceptual systems when there is number. As I said, there's many cultures that won't have exact quantification beyond the subitizing range. So this is an important distinction to be made. It's not just because we have 10 fingers. We do, like many other animals do in the upper limbs, let's say. But the crucial thing is symbolic reference, that we're able to recruit that. What is interesting, however, is that not because we have that, all humans would have the same way of recruiting them. In fact, there's huge, tremendous variation in how to do the counting with fingers, which is part of the work that Andrea Bender and Bella did, characterizing some of this. So there's huge, important cultural variations, which is a very good indicator saying this is not biologically determined. So how the hand tool, let's say the pentadactyl hand, is recruited for symbolic reference, it varies tremendously from cultures to cultures, that those that do have number. So even when you look at, let's say, written exact symbolic numbers, some interesting research has been done in for example, the neuroscience of numerical tasks. In this case, comparing English native speakers and Chinese native speakers, and Tang et al., they analyze, for very simple tasks, what were the, let's say, cortical areas at least, recruited for supporting for this very simple tasks. And they showed some interesting differences in the different kind of areas. I'm not going to go into the details, but for example, here you have in the perisylvian area, in Broca's areas, Wernicke's area, more active recruitment in the English speakers in the left hemisphere than, let's say, the Chinese speakers. So this would apparently point to more like you have cultural variation, even though the presentation of the tasks was the same. They are apparently recruiting different kinds of neural correlates for supporting those particular activities, which point to the fact that there's culturally shaped cortical phenotypical plasticity occurring here in the ontogeny of individuals. So if I want to give like an analogy here of the biological enculturation hypothesis, we can use, for example, the notion of, is there an evolved capacity for snowboarding? Let's replace that for a minute in terms of asking the questions for number. Well, certainly there's a biologically endowed balance mechanisms, optic flow navigation, limb coordination, and so on in order to enact this particular behavior. And that, in that case, I would not disagree with many of the scholars who say, yeah, numbers are rooted in the biology. Yes, snowboarding is also rooted in the biology of our species. But they in themselves are not about snowboarding, these biologically endowed mechanisms. These are generic. They're not specific for snowboarding. And now I'll go back to that concept of specific, as opposed to generic mechanisms of optic flow navigation, balance, and limb coordination, and so on, which we start early on exercising. But just by crawling a lot and walking a lot, you don't build up. They don't scale up to sustain snowboarding. They cannot create snowboarding. In order for snowboarding to occur, you certainly need biologically evolved preconditions like these here, balance mechanisms and so on, but they're not like inevitable precursors leading to snowboarding. So this kind of behavior is not a precursor of snowboarding, or is not really early snowboarding or proto-snowboarding or primitive snowboarding. It's just crawling as part of the exercising and putting in place all these mechanisms for balance, coordination of limbs, and so on and so forth. So for snowboarding to occur, you need many cultural traits and materials and artifacts and, for example, a technology for thermic insulation. So you don't die of hypothermia, for example. You need technologies for lift skiing. So they put you at the top of the mountain. So then you can do many runs during the day, so improving the learning curve as opposed to you going down and then walking all the way up to do the second run of the day hours later when you're tired and so on. So all these things are culturally mediated, and that immerse then the learning in this in this cultural technological environment. So now we can replace snowboarding by number. All these terms that you see here, optic flow navigation and snowboarding, we replace them, let's say, with quantities, quantical cognition, subitizing, and so on. Yes, they're biologically endowed, but by themselves, they don't scale up to number or arithmetic. For that, you need cultural traits, artifacts, and biological enculturation, writing, and specific developments in language, and so on. So all those things, that's the analogy I wanted to just put in there. So we must recognize then that exact quantification is not a biological trait, but a cultural trait. It's supported by symbolic reference, which is not biologically evolvable, brought forth by cultural practices and preoccupations that don't exist in all the cultures. Those are cultural traits, along with biological phenomena that support specific phenotypical plasticity. And that's where biological enculturation begins to play the role. So the distinction between quantical and numerical seems to me essential to distinguish what is it really that brings us to what we do with numbers, as opposed to these biologically endowed mechanisms that do exist in humans and many other species, but that, according to the characterizations I'm giving here, are not numerical because they don't have those properties of numbers I discussed earlier. So we need to understand the emergence of exact quantification by trying to understand how the biology, supported by cultural practices, leads to what we call number today. So language may be necessary condition for exact quantification, is probably the case, but is certainly not sufficient condition for exact quantification, as shown by the hundreds and hundreds of languages that do not have exact quantification beyond the subitizing range. So number really is a language-mediated, conventionalized, exact symbolic quantification, and that is a cultural trait. Now, this may have occurred relatively recently in the history of humanity, and largely outside of biological evolution. So it builds on certainly on biologically evolved preconditions like subitizing or large quantity discrimination, motivated by cultural preoccupations and practices, and supported crucially by material and conceptual tools. And of course, the biology that makes enculturation possible. Without the biology, we can't do this. So we are animals, biological organisms, but we're also cultural organisms. So with that, I want to just show, for example, what kinds of things we do once we get some numbers. And one crazy thing, which is amazing, is, for example, numbers as number line, numbers as locations in space, which now is a new conception in a kind of a metaphorical sense, almost conceiving exact quantification as a location in space, in a very well-organized space. And this is an incredibly powerful and ubiquitous tool today. We see it in graphs all over, allow us to do graphs of all sorts and develop very sophisticated mathematical concepts based now on this fundamental, concept of the number line. Now, today, this is learned very relatively quickly and is present in many of the curricula around the world, and kids learn it very, not necessarily without any problem, but it's something pretty well researched in mathematics education of how kids you can develop certain materials to teach these things. Now, the fact that your number line, again, is ubiquitous has led to some cognitive neuroscientists and other people to postulate that the mental number line, or the representing numbers, are actually localized in the intraparietal sulcus. So with a specific anatomical hypothesis. So a little bit, again, is happening, okay, now the number line is somehow biologically endowed. And you see many papers talking about spontaneous mapping of number to space in children, in human infants, in rhesus monkeys, mapping number to space, and then in even chicks and every, like newborn chicks, and then again the media, in this case science, picking up, and chicks with the number sense, and chicks and humans map numbers to space in a similar way, and so on. Of course, we need to be careful because when we look at the history, we realize that there's no number lines, let's say, in the mathematically savvy Babylonians. You have about 500,000 published tablets. Only 5,000 of them have math content. The rest is, contracts and legal documents and so on. 50 would have some kind of diagrams of this sort, but there's not a single number line in these that has been found. In fact, even when you go to recent, let's 17th century, let's say the work of La Géométrie, René Descartes, you would find there's no number lines there either, even though he's the, the father of the Cartesian coordinates. But he would treat just quantities separately, let's say A and Q in this case, never put on a line, and all the narrative and the discourse would be in the same tradition as Euclidean geometry, let's say, the playing with the elements with generic quantities. So La Géométrie has 120 pages, 49 diagrams, not a single number line. In fact, the first number line that you see in history, they come in the 17th century. And one is John Napier, who's in his book describing the origin of logarithms, which is what is being credited for like his big invention, which was done for purposes of nothing to do with number lines. It was actually to facilitate calculation. Then he introduced the notion of mapping numbers onto a line to begin to make his point. And John Wallis is perhaps the first mathematician who actually, in a textual form, does some kind of arithmetic reasoning. And in his book on treatise of algebra, so in the chapter of negative squares, which is a very complicated, mathematical topic of trying to figure out why, what we call today imaginary numbers, are they really numbers, and so on. He's trying to make a case for that, and he brings arithmetic like +5 - 2 = 3, and describes a whole scene of a man walking 5 steps and going back 2, and so on. Pretty much what you would see in the elementary arithmetic book today in schools. Only that this text here is dedicated to an audience of the la crème de la crème and the experts of mathematics in European European math. So this is the time when calculus has been developed. So just imagine this now is a recent tool that appeared at that time. So we did a research to see, what is number line, this intuition universal? And when we, for example, we presented people from indigenous people, this is now from the Yupnon, Papua New Guinea, with my colleagues Kenzie Cooper-Ryder and Jörg Fassmann. We were presenting, for example, following the paradigm of the hen and others that they had done in the Amazon, with a line, and then try to see, well, if you were have to 1 dot here and 10 dots here, where would you put this many dots, for example? And those who, controls of California, of course, did their quote right thing, the encultured thing, and even the schooled Yupno, but the unschooled Yupno didn't. They just used the extremes of the segment. So no intuition that this would somehow capture the number line properties with the distance function. And then, really what stood out is the response of the unschooled, which essentially just used the extremes as opposed to, for example, those who were enculturated or schooled and the controls. Interestingly enough, in the previous study by Dehaene and colleagues, which studied the Munduruku in Brazil, an Amazonian group, they found actually 13 out of the 33 trials they did to be also based on the extremes. But unfortunately, they did not analyze this data. This data only appears in the supporting material online, and they treat it pretty much as noise, as if something occurred with those people. But even if you run a simple statistical test saying that, let's say, number line intuition is universal, if it is universal, then you would expect 0 people here in this column, and then this proportion is highly statistically significant. But even if you tolerate up to a 25%, for some reason, humans not having that intuition, then this many in that study is still statistically significant. But unfortunately, this data was not analyzed, was put aside, and just treated as like random kind of noise, and was left alone, but matches totally what the results we obtained in Papua New Guinea. So the idea here is that these are very sophisticated concepts, and you can continue developing. The hyperreal line would be an example in which you have the number line, but if you start to have now more sophisticated concept of numbers, like, for example, infinitesimal numbers that don't have the properties, let's say, Archimedean properties. So any infinitesimal number is smaller than a real number, and the inverse of an infinitesimal number is larger than any real number. So then you can now have a line where you can start to fit those numbers. So in any real point that you have here, you would have immersed an entire real line size, so to speak, in each of these. And then you could have also an infinite line, which another level of lines with a hyperreal. So essentially you would have an embedded forms of infinitely small and infinitely large numbers, where you would have now room for all the real numbers. So all this developments of notions of number in more and more sophisticated concepts, in this case going beyond the reals and covering, let's say, hyperreal numbers with infinitesimal numbers, which have completely different properties and therefore also obey different axiomatic systems. So now to close then, where do numbers come from? Well, here what we're proposing is that there is something to be understood, which is how is it the enculturation of humans supported by the biology that we know today and that we should be learning more in the future. But that goes beyond natural selection. So although ubiquitous today in the industrialized world, numerical cognition like geometry or music perhaps or visual arts should not be taken at face value or as a natural kind, so to speak. The answer to the question of what takes to move from quantical, biologically endowed, to numerical cognition actually is not trivial. Indeed, only some humans in the right social historic context and after tens of thousands of years have made that leap. So we have many questions, of course, left. What selective pressures may have given rise to quantical cognition, or what does it take to move from quantical cognition to numerical cognition, and how do these two forms relate to each other? Or what is the role of natural quantifiers in the consolidation of the number sense in children? What are the neurological underpinnings of the learning of quantifiers in natural language? And building on quantical cognition, how does exact symbolic quantification get grounded and neurally instantiated? So many of these questions are now going to be addressed in a recently awarded grant from the European Research Council that, along with some colleagues, Andrea Bender, Francesco De Rico, archaeologist, and Russell Gray, we're going to start in a couple of months in our project, Synergy grant project called Quanta, in which we're going to be studying evolution of cognitive tools for quantification. So I want to close with a quote from the renowned geneticist and evolutionary biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky, who said, "Human evolution has two components, the biological or organic and the cultural or superorganic. And these components are neither mutually exclusive nor independent, but interrelated and interdependent. Human evolution," and this is not specific to humans, "human evolution cannot be understood as a purely biological process, nor can it be adequately described as a history of culture. It is the interaction of biology and culture." And that in spirit is pretty much what is behind these biological enculturation hypothesis, in this case, to try to explain where do numbers come from. Thank you very much for listening, and I thank many of the funding agencies and colleagues who have collaborated in various steps in this process. Thank you.